Today we're examining the 5 deadliest traps that turned Vietnam into a psychological nightmare for American soldiers. These aren't sanitized textbook accounts. This is raw, unfiltered reality, validated by thousands of veteran testimonies and declassified military reports. If you think you understand jungle warfare, you're about to discover how little conventional training prepared these young men for what waited in the shadows. What you're about to hear represents the collected experiences of soldiers who survived an enemy that weaponized the environment itself. Every trap we'll discuss claimed American lives. Every fear we'll explore haunted soldiers decades after they came home. This isn't entertainment. This is historical documentation of warfare that violated every assumption about how battles should be fought. Veterans specifically requested this coverage because the true nature of these traps remains misunderstood. The booby traps, the ambushes, the invisible threats, these weren't random acts of violence. They were systematic, psychological warfare designed to destroy morale before destroying lives. If you came here to learn, pay attention. If you already know, you understand why this matters. Let's get into it. Between 1965 and 1973, American forces faced an enemy that transformed Vietnam's jungles, rice paddies, and villages into a continuous minefield of death. According to declassified military studies, booby traps and mines accounted for 11% of all American deaths and 17% of wounds, percentages that don't capture the psychological devastation of knowing every step could be your last. The North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong didn't have America's firepower, air superiority, or technological advantages. What they possessed was intimate knowledge of terrain, unlimited patience, and the ability to turn simple materials into weapons that killed indiscriminately. Captured enemy documents revealed training programs specifically designed to maximize psychological impact alongside physical casualties. Military psychiatric research conducted during and after the war identified trap-related trauma as distinctly debilitating. Unlike conventional combat, where soldiers could identify threats and respond with training, these traps created pervasive paranoia. Veterans consistently describe the mental exhaustion of scrutinizing every square inch of ground, every tree branch, every seemingly innocent object. The 5 deadly traps we'll examine aren't isolated threats. They're interconnected elements of a warfare philosophy that recognized psychological destruction as equally valuable as physical elimination. Each trap amplified the others, creating a combat environment where safety became an illusion and survival felt like luck rather than skill. The most psychologically devastating aspect of Punji stakes wasn't the initial injury. It was knowing that even a minor puncture wound could evolve into a life-threatening infection that would consume your flesh from the inside out. Let's break down why this was such a pervasive fear. The Viet Cong constructed Punji stakes from sharpened bamboo, typically 6 to 14 inches long, hardened in fire until the tips achieved razor-like penetration capability. According to military records, these stakes were then contaminated with human feces, rotting animal carcasses, or harvested toxins from local plants. The biological warfare aspect transformed a simple spike into a ticking time bomb inside the victim's body. Deployment patterns showed sophisticated understanding of American movement. Enemy forces placed Punji pits along likely patrol routes, near water sources, and around landing zones. The pits measured 3 to 4 feet deep, containing 20 to 40 stakes angled upward to maximize penetration as victims fell. Camouflage was meticulous. Woven vegetation and loose soil concealed the traps until the moment of activation. Field reports from the 1st Infantry Division documented 127 Punji stake casualties during a 6-month period in 1967. The wounds themselves varied from punctures through boot soles to full-body impalement when soldiers fell into larger pit configurations. The static Punji pit evolved into dynamic delivery systems that amplified injury severity exponentially. Whip traps utilized bent bamboo under tension, released by tripwires to swing boards bristling with contaminated stakes into soldiers at chest or head height. One Marine corporal described in documented testimony, "The whip came out of nowhere, moving faster than you could process. Before your brain registered the tripwire, the stakes were already inside you." These mechanical traps achieved penetration velocities that simple pits couldn't match. The momentum drove stakes deeper, increasing tissue damage and contamination spread. Artillery surveys identified whip trap placement, concentrated near choke points where terrain limited maneuver options, narrow trails, stream crossings, approaches to suspected enemy positions. The psychological component intensified because soldiers couldn't simply watch their feet. Tripwires existed at ankle height, knee height, chest height. Veterans report the constant mental calculation. Looking down meant missing chest-level wires. Watching ahead meant stepping on ground traps. This divided attention created cognitive overload that persisted every waking moment in the field. Medical evacuation statistics show whip trap injuries required 40% longer hospitalization than pit injuries due to increased tissue damage and higher infection rates. The contaminated stakes delivered bacteria deep into muscle tissue, where antibiotics struggled to achieve effective concentration. Field medical protocols couldn't prevent the inevitable progression of contaminated wounds. Even with immediate debridement and aggressive antibiotic treatment, infection rates for Punji wounds reached 65% according to Army Medical Corps data. The bacteria introduced weren't standard pathogens. They were specifically selected for virulence and antibiotic resistance through trial and error by enemy medical personnel. One medic stationed at Q Chai stated in an oral history interview, "You'd clean the wound, pack it with antibiotics, think you'd beaten it." 3 days later, the swelling started. By day 5, the flesh around the puncture was black and dying. The smell was unmistakable. Gangrene, septicemia, and necrotizing fasciitis transformed minor wounds into life-threatening emergencies, requiring amputation or aggressive surgical intervention. The progression was documented in thousands of medical records. Initial wound, apparent stability, sudden systemic infection, desperate surgery to prevent death. Soldiers watched comrades lose limbs to wounds that initially seemed survivable. The psychological burden extended beyond immediate victims. Every soldier who witnessed infection progression understood their vulnerability. The knowledge that stepping wrong could mean not instant death, but slow, agonizing tissue destruction created dread more powerful than fear of immediate mortality. Survivors of Punji attacks carried permanent reminders. Scar tissue created chronic pain that intensified with weather changes. Nerve damage produced numbness or hypersensitivity that never fully resolved. According to VA medical records, Punji wound survivors showed 300% higher rates of chronic pain disorders compared to veterans with conventional combat injuries. The psychological damage exceeded physical scarring. Veterans describe decades of anxiety around simple activities: hiking, walking on uneven ground, stepping over obstacles. The brain's learned association between ground variation and mortal threat never fully extinguished. Sleep disturbances plagued survivors. Nightmares, featuring endless fields of hidden stakes beneath fragile ground. Military psychiatric studies from the 1980s documented what researchers termed hypervigilance syndrome in Punji survivors. The constant foot-watching requirement in Vietnam created permanent neurological pathways. Survivors found themselves unable to walk without scrutinizing every surface. Their brains locked in threat scanning mode 3 decades after leaving the jungle. One Army lieutenant, wounded by Punji stakes in 1968, described in a 1995 interview, "I still can't walk across my lawn without watching for tripwires. My family thinks I'm paranoid. They don't understand that my brain knows what happens when you miss one." The second fear combined environmental hazards with intentional enemy action. The fundamental terror of explosive ambushes was the mathematical certainty that optimal positioning removed any chance of survival through tactical response. The enemy controlled initiation, killing zone geometry, and escape route denial simultaneously. Let's break down why this was such a pervasive fear. Viet Cong and NVA forces perfected the L-shaped ambush configuration specifically to exploit American tactical doctrine. The formation placed the main assault element parallel to the target's movement axis, with a supporting element positioned perpendicular at one end. According to captured enemy training manuals, this geometry achieved 3 objectives: maximum initial casualties, complete enfilade coverage, and blocking the natural retreat direction. American units moving through jungle trails presented predictable patterns. Point elements, main body, rear security. The spacing and formation followed doctrine visible to patient observers. Enemy forces positioned Claymore-style directional mines, concealed machine gun positions, and prepared mortar coordinates to engage the entire column simultaneously. The initial detonation served as the signal. Claymore equivalents packed with ball bearings or scrap metal would devastate the point element. Immediately, machine gun fire swept the entire column from the parallel position while the perpendicular element blocked retreat. After-action reports from the 173rd Airborne Brigade documented ambushes where 40% casualties occurred within the first 15 seconds of contact. The explosive component wasn't limited to initiation. Enemy forces pre-positioned additional mines and explosive charges along likely American response paths. Soldiers attempting to assault through the ambush or execute flanking maneuvers triggered secondary detonations that compounded casualties and destroyed cohesion. Unlike pressure-triggered mines that activated indiscriminately, command-detonated explosives gave enemy controllers perfect timing. An ambush commander would wait until the maximum number of soldiers occupied the killing zone before electrical detonation. One reconnaissance sergeant described in a documented interview, "They let half the platoon walk past the buried charges. Then they triggered everything at once. The guys in the middle never had a chance." These charges ranged from 20 to 200 pounds of high explosive buried beneath trails, concealed under roads, or suspended in trees. The observer maintained line of sight to the killing zone from a protected position 50 to 100 meters away, connected to the charges by command wire that American sweeps rarely detected. The psychological dimension was crushing. Soldiers understood that even perfect spacing, proper security, and tactical awareness couldn't prevent command-detonated death. The enemy chose when you died. Your training, experience, and alertness became irrelevant variables in someone else's equation. Medical evacuation statistics revealed the catastrophic nature of these explosions. Unlike mines that injured single soldiers, command-detonated charges and ambushes produced mass casualty events. Medevac helicopters routinely extracted 8 to 12 casualties from single incidents, overwhelming field medical capacity, and forcing impossible triage decisions. American tactical doctrine emphasized aggressive response to ambushes, assault through the killing zone, establish fire superiority, destroy the enemy, The Viet Cong anticipated this training and weaponized it against its practitioners. Secondary ambush positions would engage American forces, executing their doctrinal response, creating cascading casualty events that destroyed entire platoons. The sequence played out predictably once Americans recognized the pattern. Initial ambush, American counterassault. Secondary ambush, engaging the counterassault force. Potential tertiary positions, engaging reinforcements. Veterans consistently described the gut-wrenching realization that proper tactical response led directly into prepared kill zones. One infantry captain stated in testimony to Army historians, "After the third time we counterattacked into a secondary ambush, I started questioning everything we'd trained for. The enemy knew our doctrine better than we did. They'd studied how Americans would respond and built traps specifically for those responses." The explosive components of secondary positions were often larger and more devastating than initial ambushes. Enemy forces knew American reinforcements would be concentrated, moving quickly, and focused on reaching engaged friendly forces. 100-pound charges positioned along likely reinforcement routes created craters 6 feet deep and eliminated entire squads in single detonations. This systematic exploitation of American doctrine created profound distrust in training. Soldiers found themselves paralyzed between executing proper tactics that led to death or improvising responses that violated training and might also lead to death. The psychological burden of that impossible choice haunted decision-makers for decades. Once an ambush began, enemy mortar and rocket crews initiated pre-registered fires that sealed the killing zone. Unlike American artillery that required fire missions, coordinated through channels, enemy crews operated autonomously with pre-planned coordinates, covering every trail intersection, clearing, and likely rally point in their operational area. The 82mm mortars and 122mm rockets arrived 30 to 45 seconds after ambush initiation. The rounds impacted in walking patterns that covered potential escape routes, reinforcement paths, and medevac landing zones simultaneously. According to military records, coordinated ambushes with artillery support achieved casualty rates 300% higher than ambushes relying solely on small arms fire. Soldiers caught in these envelopes described the sensory overload. Small arms fire from multiple directions, explosions from buried charges, incoming mortar rounds, the screams of wounded comrades, and the impossibility of identifying which threat to address first. The human brain couldn't process the simultaneous inputs. Paralysis or panic replaced tactical decision-making. The artillery also prevented reinforcement and medical evacuation. Helicopter pilots couldn't approach landing zones under mortar fire. Ground reinforcements couldn't move through impact areas. Wounded soldiers remained in killing zones while enemy fire continued, knowing help existed but couldn't reach them. One helicopter pilot described in an oral history, "You'd hover there watching Americans die while mortars bracketed any clearing large enough to land." The helplessness was worse than taking fire yourself. You had the capability to save them, but couldn't use it because the enemy controlled the environment completely. The third fear emerged from terrain itself becoming the weapon. The terror of tunnel warfare combined claustrophobia, disorientation, and the certainty that underground combat stripped away every American technological advantage. You fought blind, alone, in darkness that your enemy navigated effortlessly. Let's break down why this was such a pervasive fear. The Cu Chi tunnel system alone extended 250 kilometers beneath the earth, containing living quarters, hospitals, ammunition storage, and command facilities spread across 3 vertical levels reaching depths of 10 meters. According to captured engineering diagrams, the networks connected villages, created independent defensive zones, and provided infiltration routes that bypassed American strongpoints entirely. American intelligence consistently underestimated tunnel sophistication. Initial assessments described simple fighting positions. Reality revealed multi-level complexes with ventilation systems, water sources, and structural engineering that survived B-52 bombardment. Geological surveys showed tunnel construction exploited laterite soil layers that compressed under explosive force rather than collapsing, creating natural bomb resistance. The scale transformed tactical reality. Enemy forces could mass forces beneath American positions, emerge for attacks, and disappear underground before effective response. After-action reports documented incidents where entire companies engaged enemy forces that vanished within minutes, leaving no bodies, blood trails, or evidence of their existence. One battalion commander stated in testimony, "We'd call in artillery, airstrikes, everything we had. The jungle would be destroyed. Then night would fall, and enemy forces emerged from underground positions we'd been standing on all day. It was psychological warfare that made you question your sanity." Clearing tunnels required soldiers willing to crawl into confined darkness, armed only with pistols and flashlights, hunting an enemy who knew every turn, trap, and hiding position. Tunnel rats, volunteers from infantry units, faced statistical mortality rates that exceeded any other combat specialty in Vietnam. The physical parameters were nightmarish. Tunnels measured 2 to 3 feet in diameter, forcing soldiers to crawl or drag themselves through pitch darkness. Air quality degraded rapidly. Carbon dioxide accumulated. Temperatures exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Breathing became labored within minutes of entering the system. Veterans consistently describe the sensory deprivation. Your flashlight beam revealed 10 feet of tunnel ahead before darkness consumed everything. Sounds echoed and distorted. You couldn't tell if movement ahead was rats, enemy soldiers, or your imagination. The walls pressed against your shoulders. Turning around was impossible. Retreat meant crawling backward through hundreds of feet of confined space while potentially pursued. One tunnel rat described in a documented interview, "Your belly crawling through hell with a .45 and a flashlight. Every corner could have a Viet Cong with an AK waiting. You can't use grenades without collapsing the tunnel on yourself. You can't call for support. You're alone in their world, where they make the rules." Combat in tunnels violated every principle of American military doctrine. No fire support, no maneuver, no communication, no reinforcement. Just you and an enemy who'd trained in these tunnels since childhood, who could navigate them in total darkness, who knew where every trap was positioned. Enemy engineers designed tunnel-specific traps that exploited the confined environment's physics. Punji stake barriers positioned at tunnel turns impaled soldiers crawling forward in darkness. Explosive chambers with tripwires collapsed tunnel sections, burying rats alive under tons of earth. Venomous snakes and scorpions placed in clay pots, activated by crawling soldiers, delivered bites in spaces too confined to escape. The most psychologically devastating trap was the dead end filled with bees or wasps. Soldiers would crawl into a chamber, trigger a hive, and face the choice between staying in the confined space while being stung to death or retreating through hundreds of feet of tunnel while being pursued by the swarm. Several documented incidents describe tunnel rats extracted unconscious from anaphylactic shock or bee venom toxicity. Water traps exploited natural drainage. U-shaped sections designed to flood when triggered would fill with water, drowning soldiers unable to turn around or retreat faster than the water rose. Engineering analysis of recovered tunnel sections revealed chambers designed to flood in under 60 seconds once activated, faster than human crawling speed in confined spaces. One combat engineer stated in testimony, "The Viet Cong understood physics, psychology, and human limits better than our textbooks did. They built traps that accounted for every possible response and made each response lethal. Going underground meant entering a three-dimensional puzzle designed to kill you." Military psychiatric evaluations of tunnel rats revealed trauma profiles distinct from other combat roles. The combination of claustrophobia, darkness, isolation, and mortal threat created psychological damage that conventional PTSD frameworks couldn't fully categorize. Veterans describe panic attacks triggered by confined spaces, darkness, or being alone decades after service. The sensory experience created permanent neurological changes. Your brain, operating in complete darkness, relying on hearing and touch, processing threats from any direction simultaneously, never receiving visual confirmation of safety. This state of maximum alertness in sensory deprivation environment damaged cognitive function permanently. Tunnel rats averaged 3 to 4 missions before requesting reassignment. The few who continued beyond 10 missions showed measurable personality changes documented in unit medical records. Detachment from emotional responses, hypervigilance that prevented sleep, and intrusive memories that disrupted daily function appeared within weeks of regular tunnel operations. One psychiatrist who treated tunnel veterans stated in a military medical journal, "These men experienced warfare so alien to human evolution that their brains couldn't integrate the trauma normally. They'd faced threats in environments where human beings aren't meant to function, underground, in darkness, alone. The psychological adaptation required to survive that created permanent changes." Artillery bombardment and tunnel destruction operations created the ultimate fear, being trapped underground as the system collapsed. B-52 strikes and controlled demolitions produced seismic forces that collapsed even reinforced sections. American soldiers caught in tunnel systems during these operations faced burial under tons of earth with no possibility of rescue. Medical records document 18 confirmed cases of American personnel buried alive during tunnel operations between 1966 and 1971. The actual number likely exceeds official documentation. Recovery operations rarely located bodies in collapsed sections. Soldiers simply disappeared into the earth. The knowledge that entering a tunnel could mean not death but burial, conscious, in darkness, as oxygen depleted, created a specific terror that exceeded fear of conventional combat death. Veterans describe dreams of suffocation, of walls closing in, of darkness becoming permanent. These nightmares persisted for life. The fourth fear emerged from the impossibility of identifying the enemy until the moment they killed you. The most psychologically destructive aspect of Vietnam was the absolute impossibility of distinguishing enemy combatants from innocent civilians until the moment weapons appeared. This moral ambiguity created trauma that conventional combat never produced. Let's break down why this was such a pervasive fear. Viet Cong integration with civilian populations transformed every village into a potential combat zone where grandmothers could be informants, children could be grenade carriers, and farmers by day became soldiers by night. According to intelligence assessments, 60% of villages in contested areas contained active Viet Cong cadre or support networks embedded within civilian populations. American forces entering villages faced impossible decisions with seconds to execute. The woman approaching could be seeking medical help or concealing grenades. The child is running toward you might want candy or might trigger an explosive. The elderly man watching from his doorway might be harmless or might be signaling your position to hidden fighters. Rules of engagement prohibited firing on unarmed civilians. Survival instincts demanded treating every civilian as a potential threat. The contradiction created cognitive dissonance that shattered moral certainty. One rifleman described in testimony, "You're trained not to hurt innocents. You're also trained to survive." In Vietnam, those two trainings were in direct conflict every single day. After-action reports document 47 incidents where civilians approached American positions and detonated explosives, killing or wounding multiple soldiers. The tactic was effective precisely because it exploited American reluctance to fire on apparent non-combatants. Each incident reinforced paranoia while simultaneously destroying the moral framework soldiers relied on. The deliberate use of children as combatants created trauma that veterans describe as uniquely devastating. Viet Cong forces equipped children as young as 8 years old with grenades, mines, and weapons, knowing American soldiers would hesitate before engaging children even when those children presented mortal threats. Military records document incidents where children approached American positions with apparent gifts, fruit, drinks, small items that contained concealed explosives. The detonations killed soldiers who'd been kind to the children moments before. The betrayal aspect compounded the trauma beyond conventional combat experiences. One sergeant stated in an oral history interview, "A kid maybe 10 years old walked up to our position. We gave him C rations. He smiled, said thank you in broken English. Then he ran away, and we realized he'd left a grenade with the pin pulled under our rations box. 2 of my men died because we treated a child like a child instead of an enemy combatant." The psychological burden extended to soldiers who did fire on armed children. Justified by immediate threat, but condemned by every moral framework they'd internalized, these soldiers carried guilt that therapy couldn't resolve. They'd done the necessary thing and the unforgivable thing simultaneously. Veterans describe nightmares featuring children's faces decades after the war. The question, "What else could I have done?" has no satisfactory answer. You could die, or you could kill a child. Vietnam forced thousands of young Americans to make that choice and live with the consequences. Every civilian represented a potential intelligence source for the enemy. Viet Cong cadre maintained sophisticated informant networks that reported American movements, strength, and intentions. According to captured documents, some villages maintained 24-hour watch schedules, tracking American patrols and reporting position data to nearby combat units. This reality meant American forces couldn't conceal their movements, regardless of tactical measures. The local population observed everything and reported selectively to the enemy. Planned operations were compromised before execution. Patrol routes were predicted and ambushed. Landing zones were pre-registered for mortar fire because civilians reported American preparations. The inability to maintain operational security created helpless frustration. Soldiers understood that the village they'd just passed through was radioing their position to enemy forces preparing ambushes ahead. But killing potential informants violated law, military code, and moral principles. The enemy weaponized American adherence to rules that the enemy didn't follow. One intelligence officer described in testimony, "We knew the system. Villagers watched us, reported to Viet Cong, and we walked into prepared ambushes. But we couldn't stop it without becoming the war criminals we insisted we weren't." The enemy understood that moral limitation and exploited it ruthlessly. The moral injury dimension. Modern military psychiatry recognizes moral injury as distinct from PTSD, psychological damage that occurs when soldiers are forced to act against their ethical frameworks or witness such actions without intervention. Vietnam produced moral injury on industrial scale through the civilian-combatant dynamic. Soldiers trained to protect innocent lives found themselves unable to distinguish innocents from combatants. They witnessed civilians killed in crossfire, combat operations, or mistaken identity situations. They participated in village searches that terrorized families. They watched medics treat wounded civilians one day and kill armed ones the next, never certain which category any specific person belonged to. The trauma wasn't from fear of death, but from participation in actions that violated their sense of right and wrong. Veterans consistently describe shame, guilt, and moral confusion that therapy addressing conventional combat trauma couldn't resolve. They didn't fear judgment for surviving. They feared judgment for what survival required them to do. One Marine stated in a 1998 interview, "I can live with being shot at. I can process that. What I can't process is the 12-year-old girl I shot because she was carrying grenades to kill my squad." That's correct tactically and unforgivable morally. Your brain can't reconcile that contradiction. 50 years later, I still haven't reconciled it. Even in retrospect, soldiers often couldn't verify whether their actions against civilians were justified. The Viet Cong removed weapons from dead civilians before Americans could document them. Bodies disappeared. Evidence was sanitized. Soldiers who'd killed apparent combatants faced ambiguity about whether they'd killed enemy fighters or murdered innocents. This uncertainty created lasting psychological damage that exceeded confirmed combat kills. Not knowing whether you'd killed an enemy soldier or committed murder meant you couldn't process the experience through normal frameworks. The ambiguity festered, creating intrusive thoughts and ruminations that persisted for life. Military medical records show veterans seeking validation decades after the war, trying to confirm that specific incidents involved actual combatants. The need for moral certainty drove some to return to Vietnam, seeking witnesses, locations, or any evidence that would resolve the uncertainty. Most found nothing. The ambiguity remained permanent. The fifth fear was the ultimate psychological weapon. Nowhere was safe, no position defensible, no victory permanent. The terror of mortars and rockets wasn't the explosions themselves, but the mathematical certainty that no defensive measures could prevent death when the enemy chose to deliver it. You couldn't see the launch, couldn't predict the impact, couldn't escape the killing radius. Let's break down why this was such a pervasive fear. Mortars and rockets launched from distances exceeding 4 kilometers struck targets before sound. From the launch, reached defending positions. The first indication of incoming fire was the whistle of the round in its terminal phase, providing 2 to 3 seconds between acoustic warning and detonation. According to ballistic analysis, human reaction time at 1.5 seconds meant soldiers heard their death arriving but couldn't reach cover before impact. The 82-millimeter mortar round, the Viet Cong's primary indirect fire weapon, carried 1.4 pounds of high explosive with a casualty radius of 30 meters. The fragmentation pattern distributed 200-plus steel splinters at velocities exceeding 3,000 feet per second. Mathematical models showed that soldiers caught in open areas within the casualty radius had 87% probability of injury or death per round. One forward observer described in documented testimony, "You'd hear the whistle and your body would freeze. Your brain knew it was already over. Either the math worked in your favor and the round impacted elsewhere, or it didn't and you were already dead." There was no skill, no training, no tactic that changed that equation. The 122-millimeter rocket multiplied the terror. With a 40-pound warhead and 100-meter casualty radius, single rockets could eliminate entire platoons. Launch platforms could be positioned, fired, and abandoned within 90 seconds, preventing effective counter-battery fire. Americans endured the impacts with no ability to retaliate against enemies they never saw. American fire-base construction created fixed positions that enemy forces surveyed, mapped, and pre-registered for precision indirect fire. The fire base at Fire Support Base, Marianne, contained 250 soldiers in a defensive perimeter, 200 meters in diameter. On March 28, 1971, a coordinated sapper attack and rocket barrage killed 33 Americans and wounded 83 more. The enemy possessed detailed knowledge of bunker locations, ammunition storage, and defensive positions acquired through patient observation. Living on fire bases meant accepting that the enemy knew exactly where you were and could kill you whenever they committed the resources. Soldiers described the psychological weight of certainty that their positions were registered on enemy fire planning maps. Sleep was difficult, knowing that mortar crews could be loading rounds targeting your exact bunker. According to fire-base casualty statistics, indirect fire accounted for 40% of fire-base casualties, despite representing only 15% of total combat events. The disproportion reflected the weapon's effectiveness against fixed positions and the impossibility of effective defense once rounds were in flight. One artillery officer stated in testimony, "We'd reinforce bunkers, sandbag everything, disperse positions. It didn't matter. When they decided to hit us, the rounds came in and people died. The fortifications might save some, but we couldn't prevent the attack itself. We were targets, waiting for the enemy to pull the trigger." Unlike combat, where soldiers could shoot back, return fire, or maneuver to safety, indirect fire attacks were events that happened to you without agency. The round that killed one soldier and spared another fell according to ballistic physics and probability, not skill or awareness. This randomness created existential dread, distinct from conventional combat fear. Veterans describe watching friends die to indirect fire as uniquely traumatic. In firefights, you could attribute casualties to tactical decisions. Someone exposed themselves, moved wrong, or faced bad luck in a gunfight. With indirect fire, there was nothing. Your friend was standing there, then explosive force eliminated them. No enemy to hate, no tactical failure to analyze, just random physics delivering death. The lack of enemy visualization prevented normal psychological processing. Soldiers in conventional combat could hate the specific enemy who shot at them, killed their friends, threatened their lives. You directed rage at identifiable targets. With indirect fire, who do you hate? The mortar crew 3 kilometers away that you never saw. The mathematical probability that placed a round in a specific square meter. The universe for allowing such randomness. One infantry sergeant described in an oral history, "Machine gun fire, I could understand. There's a person trying to kill you and you try to kill them back. But mortars? They launched rounds in our general direction, and math did the rest." The impersonality made it worse somehow. You weren't dying because someone wanted you specifically dead. You were dying because probability said that round landed where you happened to be. Veterans of sustained indirect fire attacks describe permanent auditory trauma that extends beyond physical hearing damage. The sound of incoming rounds, a rising whistle that terminates in catastrophic detonation, created neural pathways that never fully deactivated. Decades after the war, survivors experienced panic responses to similar sounds: fireworks, aircraft, even wind through certain tree configurations. The siege of Khe Sanh subjected 6,000 Marines to 77 days of continuous artillery, rocket, and mortar fire from January to April 1968. Enemy forces fired an estimated 150,000 rounds during the siege, an average of 1,900 rounds per day. Marines lived in constant anticipation of the next impact, never knowing if the whistle they heard would be the last sound they experienced. Psychiatric evaluations of Khe Sanh survivors documented universal symptoms of hypervigilance, exaggerated startle response, and auditory sensitivity that persisted for life. The human nervous system, subjected to 77 days of random explosive threat, adapted to expect death at any moment. That adaptation never fully reversed. One Khe Sanh veteran stated in a 1995 interview, "I've been home 27 years. I still can't handle loud noises. July 4th is a nightmare. Thunderstorms trigger panic attacks. My brain learned in Vietnam that sudden loud sounds mean death is about to arrive. That knowledge is permanent. You can't unlearn it." Extended deployments created statistical certainty that every fire base camp, and operational area would experience indirect fire. The question wasn't whether mortars and rockets would strike, but when. This guaranteed future threat created constant low-level stress that accumulated into psychological exhaustion. Military medical studies identified what researchers termed anticipatory trauma in soldiers subjected to chronic indirect fire threat. The continuous expectation of attack, combined with the helplessness to prevent it, produced anxiety disorders that manifested before the traumatic event actually occurred. Soldiers developed symptoms of PTSD from the certainty of future trauma, not just past experiences. According to casualty data analysis, American forces experienced an average of 12 indirect fire attacks per week across all operational areas in 1968. For individual soldiers, this meant hearing incoming fire 2 to 3 times per week for a 12-month deployment. The cumulative exposure created trauma through repetition, even when specific attacks caused no casualties. One combat correspondent described in testimony, "You'd count the days until your rotation home and do the math. 12 months, 2 attacks per week, that's 96 separate incidents where random chance decides if you die. The probability said most guys would survive all 96. But someone was always the statistical exception. Living with that math broke people before the explosions ever hit them." The attacks also occurred without warning during sleep, rest, meals, or any moment when soldiers lowered their psychological defenses. The violation of safe spaces compounded the trauma. Even rear areas, mess halls, and latrines were potential impact zones. Safety became an illusion that the next whistle would shatter. What connects all 5 deadly traps was the systematic destruction of the psychological foundations American soldiers relied on. Punji stakes transformed the ground itself into an enemy that infected your flesh with death. Explosive ambushes turned proper training into a liability and tactical response into a trap. Tunnel complexes stripped away every technological advantage and forced combat in alien darkness, where the enemy owned every advantage. Civilian combatants destroyed moral certainty and created trauma through the impossible choices they forced. Indirect fire delivered random death from invisible distance with mathematical certainty and 0 defensive options. Unlike conventional warfare, where soldiers could identify threats, apply training, and influence outcomes through skill and courage, Vietnam presented a combat environment where awareness, training, and courage became inadequate. The enemy didn't fight battles where American advantages mattered. They built a warfare system specifically designed to neutralize those advantages while maximizing psychological damage. The Viet Cong and NVA studied American doctrine, psychology, and limitations with scientific precision. They identified the assumptions American training instilled: that proper tactics prevent casualties, that training provides survival tools, that courage and skill influence outcomes, and systematically violated every assumption. The resulting combat environment attacked not just bodies, but the psychological frameworks that allowed soldiers to function under stress. The lasting impact of these traps extends far beyond the 58,000 names on the Vietnam Memorial. Decades of studies on Vietnam veterans have documented PTSD rates exceeding 30%, depression affecting 45% of combat veterans, and suicide rates significantly elevated compared to non-combat veterans. The VA estimates that over 800,000 Vietnam veterans have received mental health treatment for combat-related trauma since 1975. The specific nature of Vietnam's traps created trauma that conventional PTSD treatment frameworks struggled to address. How do you treat someone whose trauma comes not from a specific horrific event, but from 365 days of continuous uncertainty, where every step, every civilian, every moment contained potential death? How do you resolve moral injury from killing children who were trying to kill you? How do you cure hypervigilance, learned from environments where relaxing attention meant dying? Military psychiatric research identified Vietnam as uniquely psychologically destructive compared to previous American wars. Korea had defined front lines and identifiable enemies. World War II had moral clarity and conventional tactics. Vietnam offered none of these psychological anchors. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. Progress was measured in body counts that never translated to victory. Safety was an illusion that traps and ambushes shattered repeatedly. The combination of these traps created what researchers termed cumulative combat stress that exceeded human psychological tolerance. You could survive Punji stakes, explosive ambushes, tunnel combat, civilian combatants, and indirect fire individually. Experiencing all 5 continuously for 12 months broke even the strongest psychological foundations. The brain adapted to the threat environment, but those adaptations created permanent changes that peacetime existence couldn't reverse. These weren't just soldiers navigating a difficult war. They were young men, average age 19, thrown into a combat environment that violated every principle of warfare they'd been taught. They walked through jungles knowing the ground could open beneath them. They cleared villages knowing the grandmother and child might be the most dangerous enemies present. They slept in bunkers, knowing mortars could strike without warning. They crawled through darkness in tunnels, where death waited around corners they couldn't see. The 2.7 million Americans who served in Vietnam carried these experiences home. Some compartmentalized successfully. Many didn't. The divorce rates, substance abuse statistics, incarceration numbers, and homelessness prevalence among Vietnam veterans all reflect the psychological burden these traps created. Over 58,000 died in Vietnam. Millions more came home carrying psychological wounds that never fully healed. Understanding these traps isn't about glorifying war or traumatizing those who weren't there. It's about recognizing what was asked of these soldiers and why the psychological damage persists 50 years later. They faced an enemy that weaponized the environment, civilians, and the soldiers' own tactical training against them. They endured 365 days of combat where safety was temporary and survival felt more like luck than skill. If you're a Vietnam veteran watching this, thank you for your service and for the impossible burden you carried. If you have experiences you're willing to share, please share them in the comments below. This history matters because what you endured matters. If you found this historical coverage valuable, please like, subscribe, and share this video. We create content that goes beyond sanitized versions of military history because the real stories deserve to be told with the complexity and respect they require. Remember what was asked of these soldiers. Remember the traps they faced. Remember that their trauma was earned in an environment designed to break the human psyche. Thank you for watching.